Thanks so much for joining us today. God wants to do so much for you and through you, and we'd love to hear about it. Take a moment to send your story to stories@parkerhill.org. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can do that by going to parkerhill.org/give and choose the giving option that works best for you. Well, thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoy today's message.
Welcome, everybody. So good to have you guys here today as we kick off a brand new series called You'll Be Glad You Did. And let me just tell you the big idea, the main idea behind this series. We're going to be talking about the fact that there are certain things that we can do in one stage of life that when we get to the next stage of life, we look back and we say, man, I am so glad I did that. And on the flip side, there are certain things we can fail to do in one stage of life, and then when we get to the next stage of life, we look back and we say, I wish I had done that. And we all know what this is like, right? I'm sure most of you have had people in your past who loved you, who spoke wisdom into your life, who gave you some kind of advice, and then later you look back and say, you know what, it didn't make sense at the time. But I'm so glad I listened to my parents. I'm so glad I listened to my first boss. I'm so glad I listened to that coach. Or conversely, you look back and say, man, I wish I had paid attention. I wish I had listened. I mean, we go through life and we all say one of these two things. So if I could take this entire series and just boil it down to one sentence, I would boil it down this way. Your present will become the past that shapes your future. Your present will become the past that shapes your future. See, the choices you make today will eventually shape the person that you become tomorrow. And so throughout this series, we're going to be talking about how to make decisions in your current stage of life that in a future stage of life will leave you saying, I'm glad I did, rather than, I wish I had. All right, so let me give you an overview of where we're going in this series. We're going to begin this series today by talking about some things you'll be glad you did as a young person. Then next week, we'll talk about some things you'll be glad you did as a spouse. And we're going to talk about one very important principle that applies not just to marriage, but to all relationships. You'll want to be here next week. We'll spend 2 weeks talking about things you'll be glad you did as a parent. The week after that, things you'll be glad you did as an empty nester, or if you don't have kids, when you're over 55. So that's my tribe right there, so I'm coming into that tribe. I've got one more daughter at home for one more year, and so we're going to talk about my group that week. So we'll make the font a little bit larger on the screen, talk louder, talk slower. Final week in the series, we'll talk about this, the things you'll be glad you did when it comes to facing death. Now, one very important note on this series, even though these messages are focused each week on certain stages of life, there will be important principles every single week for all of us to apply, no matter what stage of life we happen to be in, and that's going to be true even today as we continue to talk. So let me encourage you, make it a point to be here every single week of this series, and we've made it easier because now we have Thursday night service. So be here every single week of this series because you will be glad you did. That's right, okay? So let's begin here. Things you'll be glad you did as a young person. Now, if you're wondering if that's you, if you're wondering whether you fit into this category, let me give you a description of what I mean when I say young person. So there's this survey that comes out every year. It's called the Beloit Mindset List. And it's published every year by Beloit College in Minnesota. And what they do every year is they make a list of things that define the incoming freshman class every year, okay? So I'll show you a few things from the most recent list, and these things would be true of kids who are this year in their first year of college, and there's 50 of them, okay? So I won't go through all of them. I'll give you 5, okay? So in their lifetimes, BlackBerry has gone from being a wild fruit to being a communication device to becoming a wild fruit again. Oh, remember the BlackBerry if you're older. When they see wire-rimmed glasses, they think Harry Potter, not John Lennon. Okay, that's what we're talking about when we talk about young people. U.S. Supreme Court decisions have always been available on its website. That's all they know, young people. This one, press pound on the phone is now translated as hit hashtag. Entirely different meaning. And one more. To them, Justin Timberlake has always been a solo act. Okay? So if you fit any of those descriptions, if they sound familiar, then tonight's message is for you. but not just for you, because this message is for all of us, because many of us wouldn't describe ourselves as young people, but we have young people in our lives. Young people that we have the opportunity to love and influence and maybe give some advice to. So even if you wouldn't think of yourself as a young people, I want you to listen carefully to this message, because there's some young people in your life that may need these principles, and you may be the only one in their life to share these with them, okay? So today, as we talk about this idea, what you'll be glad you did as a young person, I want to focus your attention with me on a passage of scripture that's tucked away in the part of the Bible that we call the Old Testament. It's a book called Ecclesiastes. Funny name for a book of the Bible, but if you don't have church background, if you're not familiar with the Bible, let me give you some of the background of Ecclesiastes. The word Ecclesiastes literally means teacher. And it comes from the very first verse in the book of Ecclesiastes. Here's how it begins. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. And then the book goes on. Now, the son of David who was king in Jerusalem, do you know who that was? That was Solomon, who is described in the Bible as the wisest man who ever lived. And if you read the book of Solomon, you get the clear sense that he's writing this toward the end of his life. So he comes to the end of his life, and he wants to pass on, he wants to share the wisdom that he's gained over many years with the generation that's coming behind him. And so in chapter 12, final chapter in this book, he gives some powerful, powerful words of wisdom to those who are young. And here's how chapter 12 starts. It starts this way. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Key phrase right there in this passage. If you remember nothing else from Ecclesiastes chapter 12, remember that phrase. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. So Solomon, he gets to the end almost of his own life. He looks back over his life, all his mistakes, all his successes. He says, listen, as a young person, whatever you do, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Now, I don't know if you recognize this or not, but this is such counter-cultural advice. Like, this is pretty much the opposite of what young people in our culture hear every single day, because the message young people hear in our culture is this: you're young, you're healthy, go out and have fun, get drunk, hook up, party hard, because you only are young once, and you might as well enjoy it. And then when you get older, then you can settle down, get serious about life, get serious about faith. And tragically, that's the message given to young people in our culture every single day, not just by our culture, but sometimes even by their parents. And Solomon says, no, don't do that. The worst time in your life to forget about God is when you're young. He says, don't forget about your Creator now. Now, when you're choosing a career, now when you're dating and choosing a life partner, now when you're establishing patterns that you're going to carry with you for the rest of your life, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, because the decisions you make then will have a ripple effect for the next 30, 40, 50 years. Then he goes on to say this: remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. Do you know what he's talking about there? He's talking about the process of growing old. And then he continues writing here, and he gives this fascinating, very poetic description of the aging process, those years that are approaching. He says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before, verse 2, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark and the clouds return after the rain. Do you know what he's talking about there? It's very beautiful, very poetic. He's talking about mental sharpness, mental acuity. He says there is coming a time when your mind will feel as if it is in a fog. When you're young, you have creativity and you have wit and you have a strong mind and you have a good memory. But then as that aging process progresses, right, your mind begins to fade a little bit. And you can never remember where you put the car keys. And even worse, you get out in the parking lot and can't remember where you parked the car. But you take a supplement that's supposed to help your memory, but you go to buy it and you can't remember what it was called. And Solomon says, listen, when your mind is strong, when you're creative and sharp, love God, pursue him with all your heart then. Don't wait till later. Then he goes on to say this. He says, when the keepers of the house tremble, the keepers of the house, do you know what that's describing? Your hands. Your hands are the keeper of your house. It's what protects you. It's what cares for your body. As you age, they sometimes begin to tremble, and the strong men stoop. It's talking about your legs because your legs are the strongest part of your body, and it gets harder to stand up straight and strong. Now, this next phrase, you don't have to be a seminary graduate to understand this next one, right? When the grinders cease because they are few, what's that talking about? Teeth, yeah. And the great thing is we live in an age now where we can get dentures and hearing aids and glasses and all of that, so we're very blessed, but it's kind of like, dismantling a car when you go to bed at night, but at least we can compensate for it, right? When the grinders cease because they are few, you remember your Creator in the days of your youth, and those looking through the windows grow dim. What's that talking about? Your eyes begin to fade, and you get the large print, and you get the reading glasses, and you have to buy 10 pair of these because you keep losing them because of the whole memory thing, and you don't remember where you put them. And he goes on to say this in verse 4, continuing this description. When the doors to the street are closed and the sound of grinding fades. He's talking about hearing. But then there's an irony to all this because he says, when people rise up at the sound of birds, but all their songs grow faint. And the idea is this, that even though it's getting harder to hear, the slightest sound can wake you up and you just can't go back to sleep. Verse 5. When people are afraid of heights and of dangers in the streets, there's this thing that happens emotionally as you become very, very old, because when you get to that point, the rest of the world seems to be moving faster and faster and faster, and it seems threatening, and it seems overwhelming, and it seems a little bit dangerous, and so you don't want to venture out anymore, and so you just kind of stay home, you stay inside. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth before, listen to the next phrase, when the almond tree blossoms. Do you know what that's talking about? An almond tree that blossoms, kind of like a dogwood tree that's blossoming around here right now. It's this beautiful white color, and then the blossoms fall off. Do you know what it's talking about? It's talking about hair, or the lack thereof. And the grasshopper drags itself along. You know, there was a time in your life when you had strength and energy and you moved quickly, but then as age begins to take over, you move much more slowly and with much more difficulty. And then remember, this is Solomon writing this. If you know his history, he ends this way, and desire is no longer is stirred. Yes, that is talking about what you might think it is talking about. But fortunately, 3,000 years ago, there were not awkward TV commercials about it. So Solomon, he paints this fascinating picture of what life will eventually look like for all of us as we grow older, should God grace us with many years. But then in verse 6, he goes on and just talks about death itself in very stark terms. And death that may come at any time, not even after you've aged. He says, remember your Creator, remember him, before the silver cord is severed, the spinal cord, and the golden bowl is broken, that's your head, before the pitcher is shattered at the spring, that's your heart, and the wheel is broken at the well, that's your circulatory system, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Aren't you so glad you came to church today? That is so cheery. What is Solomon doing here? He was just reminding young people of something that we all know that we tend to not think about, and that's the fact that every day brings us one day closer to the end of this life, one day closer to the finish line. And he's saying, listen, don't wait until the last season of your life to love and worship and serve your Creator. Serve him now while you're young. While you can move, while you have strength, while your mind is strong, when you have creativity, serve him and live for God with a purpose. And then he summarizes this section in verse 8 with these words. He just says this, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. I mean, if you ever read the book of Ecclesiastes, sometimes you just get this impression that Solomon needed a good hug. I mean, so depressing. But listen, here's what he's not saying that life is without purpose. He's not saying that there's no real point to life. This word meaningless, it's a very rich word, very deep word. Has many shades of meaning, but it's the Hebrew word habel. And it literally means, here's what it means. It means vapor or smoke or breath. He's saying all this stuff that you're so focused on when you're young, it's like a vapor. It's like smoke. It's here, and then it's gone. His father David, and this word is used this way all throughout the Old Testament, his father David in Psalm 39, he said, "The span of my years is as nothing before you. Each man's life is but a breath." I mean, think about exhaling on a cold morning and you see your breath, but then it vanishes before your eyes. This is your life. This is my life. Time passes so quickly. It's like a breath. It's like a vapor. By the way, did you hear about this new watch that came out a couple of years ago? The watch is, the brand name is Ticker. And it's a very interesting watch because at the bottom part of the dial, there's the local time. But all this up here, this counts down your life expectancy in terms of years, months, days, hours, minutes, and seconds. It's fascinating. When you buy one of these, you fill out a form and you submit it with your age, risk factors, health history, things like that. Then they program the watch and they send it to you with your projected date of death, and it counts down a second at a time. I am not making this up. This really exists. Do not buy me one. I don't want to see it. It was invented by a 37-year-old guy named Frederick Colting, who had a summer job as a gravedigger. And in his summer job as a gravedigger, he began to realize how precious life really is. And so he invents this watch called the Ticker. This is what it says on the website. The Ticker watch was designed to provide you with a constant reminder that life is truly short and we should take advantage of the time we have on this planet. You know, I think if Solomon were alive today, he'd buy one of those watches for every single young person. I think he would. Because here in Ecclesiastes 12, he's speaking to young people, but even though they're young, he's reminding them of the end of their lives and how swiftly time passes. And he's saying, listen, your life is like a breath on a cold morning. It's here and then it's gone, so don't waste it. Don't waste a moment of it. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Now, let me tell you why you've got to pay attention to that advice, especially if you're young. And I'll let you define that. But when we're young, we make decisions that have implications for the rest of our lives. And then as we grow older, we begin to reap the consequences of those decisions that we made when we were young. I'll give you a way to think about it. Many of you know that one of the things I really enjoy doing is hiking. And the place where I love to go and hike is up in the Adirondack Mountains in New York State. There are 46 high peaks, 4,000 feet or higher. And my goal by the time that I bite the dust is to climb all 46 of those high peaks. I think I've climbed like 26 or 27. So what we do whenever we go up there is first of all, we get a trail map and we figure out which peak or which peaks we want to climb. And then we find out where the trailhead is and the parking lot is for that trailhead. And then you park in that parking lot and you head off on the trailhead. And most of these trails, in a short while, you follow the main trail, but then you come to a trail junction that might look like this. This is actually in the Adirondacks. And so you come to this trail junction, and you've got to read the signs very carefully, and you've got to make sure you choose the right trail, because here's the thing. If you choose the wrong trail at the trail junction, you will always wind up at the wrong destination. And when we're young, we're choosing a path. we come to these junctions in our lives, and we have to choose a path. And Solomon says, when you're choosing a path, remember your Creator. Don't ignore your Creator, not now, not at this point in your life when you're choosing who you're going to marry, who you're going to spend time with. Not now when you're choosing a career. Not now when you're establishing patterns that you'll carry with you through the rest of your life. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Otherwise, you may wake up one day and say, how did I get here? How did I get into this marriage? How did I get into this addiction? How did I get into this financial mess? This was not the destination I wanted to head for. Let me tell you a couple of things about wilderness hiking. One of the things is this: when you get to the trail junction, and if you choose the wrong trail, over time, the wrong trail will diverge more and more from the correct trail, and you will get farther and farther from your desired destination, and you may not even realize it because all the trees out there look the same. And here's the other thing about wilderness hiking. If you discover one day you're on the wrong trail, you don't just cut over to the right trail, because there's so much dense underbrush and undergrowth that you would need a machete and a chainsaw in about 3 days to get there. So when you're on the wrong trail, you got to go all the way back to where you went wrong, and you find the right trail, and you can lose hours of time that way. But listen, when you get lost in life, you don't just waste hours or days. You may waste an entire season of your life. Choosing the wrong path can cost you years, and nobody wants that. Nobody wants to wake up in their 50s and look back and wish they had taken a different path in their 30s. Nobody wants to get to the end of a marriage and look back and wish they had taken a different path in their dating life. See, your present will become the past that shapes your future. I want to read a couple more verses here in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, because Solomon now talks to the rest of us, okay? The rest of us who are maybe not quite so young. He said, not only was the teacher, and who's the teacher? Solomon. He's talking about himself in the third person. Kind of strange, but he does. Not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. In other words, Solomon is saying, listen, God blessed me with all this wisdom. I was not going to keep it to myself. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. He's at the end of writing this book. And the teacher searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. And so as Solomon wraps up this writing that we call Ecclesiastes, he basically says, listen, throughout my lifetime, God has given me wisdom. Some of it God earned the hard way. Some of it he just blessed me with. But I don't want to keep it to myself, and that's why I've written down these words and done my best to share with the next generation what I have learned. And there's a lesson here for us, that those of us who live for a little while, we got some scars, we've made some mistakes, we've gained some wisdom in the process. We have a responsibility to share that with the next generation so that they don't maybe have to learn the same way that we did. I want to show you this picture. This is a picture from the 2016 Summer Olympic Games. This is the women's 4x100 meter relay. And this is the U.S. team, two members of the U.S. team right here. And you'll notice that right there. Do you know what that is? That is the baton falling onto the track. The U.S. team missed the handoff. They dropped the baton, and so even though they were the fastest team on the track, they were disqualified simply because they couldn't make the handoff. The most important part of a relay race is always the handoff of the baton. If you can't do that well, you can never win the race. And I think the same thing happens like this all the time, in my opinion, between generations. I think we often do a very poor job of passing off the baton of our faith and the baton of our wisdom. I think there are two reasons why that happens, two attitudes that cause that. First of all, for the older generation, we can be tempted to say this, been there, done that. In other words, as you grow older, it's real tempting to say this, I've had my day, I've put in my time, I'm going to let the next generation handle things now. And people say this, and then they move to Florida and spend their years playing golf and watching the History Channel and walking around the shopping mall mumbling about why their kids never call. And so we're going to talk about that in a few weeks. But it's easy to say, you know what, I put my time in, I paid my dues, let them figure it out. Then on the other side, the younger generation can say this. They can say, we got this. And when you're young, you may not recognize the treasure of wisdom that older people possess, and we think we've got all the answers because we got Google, and we don't seek out their wisdom. Have you ever heard the phrase, experience is the best teacher? You probably have. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. Experience is the best teacher. It's also the most expensive teacher. Because if you only learn through your personal experience, it's going to cost you a lot of time, it's going to leave you with scars, and it's going to leave you with some unpleasant memories. Here's the great thing about life. You don't just have to learn from your own experience. You can learn from somebody else's experience. You don't have to learn from your own mistakes. You can learn from someone else's mistakes. What if those of you who are in your 60s and 70s who have a strong faith and a close walk with Jesus, what if you just opened your home and you had a group of 20 and 30-something-year-olds just come and meet in your home, and you don't have to lead the group. You know, you just sit in the circle and you be part of it, and every once in a while you just kind of meekly raise your hand and you say, excuse me, can I say something? That seems like a very interesting idea. But there's no way in the world that'll ever work. Trust me, I'm 68 years old. I went down that road. I mean, you got to say it graciously. Or you say, I know it seems hard right now, but you'll get through it. Let me tell you about my experience. I mean, this is kind of a two-way street. I believe if young people are going to remember the Creator in the days of their youth, we in the older generation need to come alongside of them and model that for them and speak truth into them after we've built a relationship with them, okay? So I've got like 8 minutes left, okay? So let me get very, very practical because we want this series to be practical. So as I wrap up, I want to talk about 4 specific areas of life where we need to make wise decisions. And this is true for all of us, but I think this is especially true if you're young. And if you will make these 4 decisions when you're young, I guarantee you, you will look back someday and you will say, I am so glad I listened to that old guy on the stage at Parker Hill Church. I'm so glad I listened to that, okay? And for each one of these, I want to give you a verse or two from the Book of Proverbs. It comes right before Ecclesiastes, the Book of Proverbs, which was also written by, guess who? It was written by Solomon. Most of it was anyway. And so he speaks very specifically about some of the ways you remember the Creator in the days of your youth. Here's the first one. I'll talk about finances. Financially, stay away from debt. When you're young, and I know this from experience, it is really easy to get yourself into a financial hole that will take you years or decades to dig yourself out of. Because you pile up the student loans, you buy cars you can't afford, you eat out with your friends, and you pay every night on the credit card, and then you got your whole life ahead of you, you think to catch up. But what I see so often is that there are millions of Americans who get their first credit card in college and stay in debt the rest of their lives. Here's what Solomon says about that. He says, the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. He's just stating a fact. Like birds fly, fish swim, and the borrower is servant to the lender. And so every time you go into debt, and I'm not talking about a mortgage or wise debt, I'm talking about consumer debt, you know, all the stuff that you don't really need, but you want to impress other people with, and so you borrow the money to have it. And you create all this kind of financial pressure for yourself. And then here's the challenge with that. If you're single, what if somebody comes along and you fall in love and the two of you decide to get married? What happens when you announce to that person that you've got this whole pile of debt that you're going to bring with you into that marriage relationship? Do you know what that does, I think? It makes you a little bit less attractive. I mean, you're so cute right now, but when he finds out you got $12,000 in credit card debt, that's kind of a filter. He's like, yeah, it's kind of attractive. You know, I think she's a little bit too tall for me, you know. Or, you know, you got that hot car that she loves until she finds out you got a $30,000 loan on it. And then she thinks, you know what, I think I'll pass on the car and the guy, you know. One of the best things you can do early on in life is just start to develop good habits in the realm of your finances, because these are habits that then begin to carry through into your marriage and to the rest of your life. And you'll look back someday and you'll say, what? I'm so glad I did. Number 2, relationally, stay connected to wise people. Stay connected to wise people, because if we want to become the people we need to be, we've got to surround ourselves with the right influences. We've got to have the right people with us on the journey at any age, but I think especially when you're young and you're making all of these life-altering decisions. Here's how Solomon said it in Proverbs 13. He says, "The one who walks with the wise will become wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm." And there's both a promise and a warning in that verse. The promise is if you spend your time with wise people, their wisdom is going to rub off on you. You're going to be better for it. But if you hang out with fools, you're going to get the shrapnel from their foolish decisions, and you're going to pay the price for that. You know, we usually think of peer pressure as only a bad thing, but peer pressure is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a thing. It can be good or it can be bad, and the right kind of peer pressure can help us tremendously. Somebody once said it this way: show me your friends, and I'll show you your future. So stay away from debt. Stay connected to wise people. You'll be glad you did. And number 3 is this. The room's going to get real quiet now. Sexually, stay out of bed. Listen, in a world of Tinder and casual hookups, we've come to believe in our culture that casual sex with multiple partners is just a normal part of growing up. That's just what young adults do. It's expected, sometimes even encouraged. Listen to what Solomon says. He learned the hard way, but he said this. And again, the chapter 5 begins, "My son." He's speaking literally to his son. He says, "My son, drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well." Now, if you read Proverbs chapter 5, it becomes obvious very quickly he ain't talking about water here, okay? This is a metaphor for something else. He said, "Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares? Let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth." Let me tell you the overriding message of the Bible when it comes to sex. Some people think the overriding message of the Bible when it comes to sex is don't. That's not it. God created it. It was his idea. Like, I don't know how that all happened, but he gathers the angels around. He says, "I got this idea you are not going to believe." You know? God created sex, and it's this beautiful and it's this powerful thing, but because it's powerful, it needs to stay within certain boundaries. Sexual intimacy is like fire. Fire can warm your house if it stays in a fireplace. Fire can cook your food if it's on a stove. But when fire gets out of control, it can do a tremendous amount of damage. And we live in this culture today where the good and powerful gift of sexual intimacy has been completely removed from its God-given context. All boundaries have been abandoned. And there's so much hurt and so much dysfunction. And my heart breaks for this generation. Not because sex is bad, just because it's so good and so powerful. And there's this myth, this message that young people hear all the time, and it's this: having sex is preparation for your marriage. You need to find out who you're compatible with. You need to find out who you're compatible with. Can I tell you something? I've never met a married person who believes that. I've never met a married person who says, "You know what? We're so glad that we were so sexually active before we got married. It has enriched our marriage so much." I mean, we sit around, we share stories about the past with each other. No married person believes that. Yet that's what our culture says every day. Sexually, stay out of bed. Relationally, stay connected to wise people. Financially, stay away from debt. One more, spiritually, stay engaged in your faith. Because when you're young, that's one of the easiest times to drift spiritually. Because that's the time of your life when you're not tied down and you're building your future. Maybe you're away from home. You're free for the first time. You're away at college. And that's when it's easy to drift spiritually, but it's also the worst time to drift spiritually. Because that's the time in your life when you come to those crossroads decisions. And you're deciding about who your friends are going to be and who you're going to date, and what you're going to do for a living, and how you're going to manage your finances, and all of that. Proverbs chapter 3, this is a father speaking to his son again. He says, "My son, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." In other words, don't think you got it all figured out, because when we're young, we think we got it all figured out. "In all your ways submit to him, and he will direct your paths." In other words, he's saying stay connected with God, submit yourself to him, because he is the one who knows where every path will eventually lead. Some versions of the Bible say, in all your ways submit to him or acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. I learned something a couple of years ago about human behavior that's fascinating. It's kind of weird, but it's very interesting. If I were to take you outside to an empty parking lot or an open field and blindfold you and tell you to walk a straight path, to walk in a straight line, you would not be able to do it. It can't be done. In the 1920s, there was a scientist by the name of Asa Schaefer who did this experiment. He got a buddy of his and he blindfolded him and asked him to walk across an open field. And Asa told his friend to do his very best to walk a straight line. And then he drew a map of every time his friend tried to do this. And no matter how many times his blindfolded friend tried to walk a straight line, he could not do it, always ended up walking in circles. And that experiment that was attempted back in the 1920s has been repeated many times with the same results. According to the research, there's only one way to walk a straight line, and that's to have your attention fixed on something in the distance. A building, a tree, a mountain, something out there, and there's a spiritual lesson behind that experiment. The only way to walk the path that we're called to walk is to constantly keep our bearings, to remember your Creator, not just in the days of your youth, but all week long, all life long, because we need a fixed point of reference. We need someone that we can fix our attention on to keep us walking in the way that we need to walk. We need our Savior to be the vision for our lives. There's an old Irish hymn that says it this way: "Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart. Not be all else to me, save that thou art. Thou my best thought, by day or by night, waking or sleeping. Thy presence, my light." Remember your Creator in the days of your youth and the rest of your life, because your present will become the past that shapes your future.